You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson.
I'm your co-host, Matthew Fisher.
And this week we were joined by Dr. Frank Salter for the third time. He's joining us this week to discuss the ethnic component of crime. This is, of course, highly relevant because of the recent stabbing in England that has fetched international headlines. Tragically, 3 young girls were stabbed by a second-generation Rwandan. We'll dive into the details on that. This is only the centre point of decades worth of trends, ideology and government policy. Unfortunately, these factors will likely lead to many more similar incidents in the future unless something serious changes. Hence why it is so important to discuss today. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Salter. Could you please tell the audience a sentence or two about your academic background?
Yeah, so I'm a political scientist. Probably some people call that an oxymoron, but I'll stick with it. Political scientist who I grew tired of the standard sociological theory used by political scientists to explain themselves, and so I took up biosocial science. So I began referring to behavioral biology in order to understand political events, and studied hierarchy, for example. That was my doctoral dissertation on hierarchy, and I compared humans with chimpanzees. Always lots of fun. And then moved to Europe, and after that began studying ethnicity, nationalism, multiculturalism, diversity, that cluster of topics, which can be called the national question. In the old days, it was called the national question. So that's still my interest, and I have several books on the subject, and hopefully that will be relevant to today's discussion.
Yeah, definitely will be. And Matthew, would you like to run us through quickly the telling of events, what actually happened in England that sparked all of these protests that we've seen since then?
Certainly. So in Southport, which is in the north of England, there was a summer holiday camp, a dance camp for a bunch of young girls, and this 17-year-old son of Rwandan immigrants came in and started stabbing them and their teacher. Unfortunately, 3 girls died, and then 6 others were injured, including the teacher and a neighbouring businessman who came in and tried to help. And what has happened since is there's been mass protests and riots within England around Southport and the neighbouring regions. We've seen reports of mosques and bookstores catering towards Muslims in the area being burnt down, and just a general sense of unrest. We've seen, and this is growing on the bigger trends of Islamic and other immigrant groups doing riots of a similar type in Leeds within last month. And more generally, this follows on from what was happening in the summer of 2020 with the BLM riots in England.
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting to take a little bit of a look at the difference between the Minneapolis and more broadly BLM riots in America and comparing that to these current riots in England. But Dr. Salter, what's your take on these events? What's your initial thoughts?
I just made some notes. I'll just read some of those notes and make comments because they're organised. I'm not. But my first thought was that the left, for example, I listened to BBC News, ABC News, the mainstream media, and they view events such as this in isolation and say, where is the problem? There's an innocent young boy, probably with mental issues, stabbed. It's a tragic stabbing, but why would a mosque be stoned? The mass violence, and they say the mass violence just appears irrational. The reaction, the public reaction to the stabbings appears irrational. That includes the attack on police, a lot of violence. And this is not usual in England, I have to say. Should be noted. This is not Paris. We have, a tradition of putting up barricades and throwing things at the coppers. The police, the English have generally supported their police. And another sign of irrationality, according to the mainstream media, is that the alleged murderer was not Islamic, but a local mosque was attacked. So they throw up their hands and say, these right-wingers are just, these nationalists, these patriots are just irrational. You can't trust their logic. And we might have heard that a day or two later there was an arson attack, a successful arson attack on a nearby police station. It was burnt to the ground. So this is serious violence now. And we need to think about why this has happened among the English. And the rioters, the demonstrators and rioters appear to be ethnic English. One has to say that because ethnic English are becoming rarer and rarer in England. My position is that, in fact, this extraordinary behaviour, so uncharacteristic of the English, has taken place in an extraordinary context. We need to understand the context. The immediate context is the recent general election in which immigration was a key issue. And the Conservative Party, which had been in government for, I think, 13 years, was greatly diminished, to put it gently. It was, by its standards, almost wiped out. I think they only won 110, 120 seats. They lost 200 seats, somewhere in that figure. The main issue during the election was immigration. People were frustrated, they were concerned, they were annoyed that their wishes that they'd been voicing, actually since before Enoch Powell, let's be honest about it. Whenever opinion polls have been taken in Britain or in Australia, there's been considerable disquiet with mass indiscriminate immigration. By indiscriminate, I mean traditionally immigration favoured immigrants of the same ethnic group or a kindred ethnic group to the nation. So assimilation would take place without much effort. And it's only since the 1970s, late 1960s and 1970s that the doctrine has been brought in that discrimination in the choice of immigrants is horrible. It's a form of racism. It's totally illegitimate and unreasonable. That's a new idea. The new idea that the government should not serve the interests of the founding ethnic group, of the nation, should not serve national interests in choosing immigrants. This is a revolutionary, radical notion, it seems to me. Anyway, so the general election was held in this context. People enraged with the Conservative Party and they punished them. A related longer-term context is successive governments' refusal to heed the electorate's concern about mass migration year after year, decade after decade, and people are furious. They're frustrated that no one represents their interests. What do I mean by there? I mean the founding ethnic group of Britain, the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish, including the Northern Irish. Also, another context is two-tier policing has become apparent. This is a very serious matter. I don't believe it's happened to anywhere near the extent in Australia. Two-tier policing, what does that mean? It means the police treating some groups when they demonstrate or when they commit crime and so on, or when they express ethnic opinions, treating them with kid gloves. A recent example of that is the mass demonstrations by pro-Palestinian people across Britain in the big cities, and they were allowed to shut down traffic. They were allowed to pray en masse in intersections, shutting down traffic and business. Any attempt to do the same by ethnic Britons is treated harshly. So there's a widespread belief, and I think it's justified, widespread belief among Britons that there's two-tier policing taking place. In other words, the police have been politicised. The police are acting in a political manner, not the English tradition of without fear or favour. That was the age-old British police standard, same in Australia. You enforce the law without fear or favour. That's gone, and that frustrated people. Another related issue is crime committed by immigrant minorities. So this stabbing doesn't come out of the blue. It's not as if it's a completely new phenomenon. What's this? Stabbing children. People, a black person stabbing white kids. This is not new. We have in Britain, they have an epidemic of knife crime. It's gone up 100% over the last decade. That's one figure I saw. Don't quote me on it. But it's at a very high level. And the crimes are committed by and largely against immigrant communities. Okay, so, and everyone knows this. So when innocent young children, 8, 9, 10 years of age, are butchered, brutally butchered, this fits a pattern of behaviour. So that helps explain why they're angry. Another related issue is to do with crime that everyone in Britain is aware of, is the systematic rape of thousands of young English girls in working class areas such as Rotherham and elsewhere. There have been thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of victims. Organised rape gangs by Pakistani Muslims, overwhelmingly by Pakistani Muslims. I think there are exceptions, but their exceptions that prove the rule. And the atrocity continues. It's not as if it happened in the 90s. It continues. So and the English are getting angry about it. And it's interesting that the mainstream media don't like to talk. They will report it, but with reluctance.
So just to add a data point to that, we've got here an article from the UK government which says a high proportion of prosecutions for mixed and black ethnic groups were against children, 12% and 9% respectively, compared to 4% for defendants from the white ethnic group. So that's quite the disparity there.
Yeah, I don't have a theory for that. Why would blacks attack children more? I don't understand.
Well, it seems to speak to some sort of mindless violence, right? Something that is very much more emotionally driven, because obviously you're not going to get possessions. You're not going to rob or steal from a child, right? There's nothing of worth that they carry. So it speaks to maybe some sort of, I suppose, mindless violence, emotionally motivated. Perhaps even hatred of the ethnic group or something like that would be motivating it, rather than, for the purposes of stealing.
Yeah, possibly.
Anyway, but please continue on with what you're saying.
I would add the speculation, or I emphasise the speculation, that it indicates to me less sympathy for children, less compassion for children. Now, children are normally spared from violence because, especially young children, because there's a universal human tendency to see a child and feel special sympathy, protectiveness for it. Now, that's stronger among women than men, but men feel it as well. And here we have an ethnic group that, for some reason, maybe they have more contact with children, but it could also be that there's just less sympathy for children. I can't imagine why. I mean, So shall we go back to my notes? I'm just getting towards the end of those notes.
Yes, please continue.
Yeah, I was just talking about Rotherham, about the sexual grooming and mass rape of thousands and thousands of English girls that's been suppressed basically by the elites in Britain. They don't want to know about it. It means it's suspiciously, from their point of view, suspiciously anti mass migration and anti multicultural to the common ear. I mean, when you hear about this sort of thing, one's first instinct, I think, is to say, well, shouldn't we be slowing down immigration, especially of Muslim Pakistanis? Would that be a good idea if they're mass raping, or part of the community is mass raping underage girls? I mean, this is an horrific crime, and it's happening on an industrial scale. So the English have been copying it. They've been taking it hard. And basically what we're seeing is the warning coming from Enoch Powell back in the late 60s coming to fruition. Enoch Powell was right on a number of points. Rising ethnic diversity is a long-term issue that has helped turn Britain into a social powder keg, it seems to me. London is now minority Indigenous British. The largest city in England is now minority Indigenous British. The Indigenous population, English, Scots, Welsh, Irish, will be a minority overall in Britain by the 1960s if trends continue as they are. Mass Indigenous Britons can see that they are being replaced by mass immigration, though told by the media and schools and universities that diversity is Britain's greatest strength. Why does it have to be the greatest strength? It's enough of a lie to say that it's a strength. Anyway, it has to be always the greatest strength. And despite complaints about rising diversity being suppressed formally and informally, scientific research shows that across many societies, diversity undermines trust, it undermines cohesion, and it fuels violence. It fuels conflict of various kinds, including political conflict and physical conflict. Okay, so there are my comments about that stabbing, and what I was taken by when I, as the rest of us did, watch this on the news, was how uncharacteristic this is of the ethnic English. Part of the context, the result of this was the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, gave a speech attacking the demonstrators, and he called them far right. This is a password, a keyword in a trigger word among far leftists, meaning if you label someone far right, you can do anything to them. You can lock them up. They just deserve to be locked up. You can take away their free speech, right? And
even to the stage of perpetrating street violence in return to them. If you can successfully classify a group of people as far right or racist, or Nazis a particular pertinent one, then you can go out and bash them and hit them with bike locks and other things like this, even if you're not a member of the police, even if you're just a street vigilante yourself, and that scene is completely warranted. But, sorry, I interrupted you. Please continue, Doctor.
No, you're correct. Now, notice that they blamed the government, and the BBC blamed the English Defence League, which was a sometimes violent demonstration group back, when was it, in the 1990s? I don't think it exists anymore. I think this is simply an invention. These people, these elites, are in such poor contact, such little contact with real Britons, with the everyday man and woman living in Britain, that they imagine, oh, the English Defence League must be doing something bad. They probably don't exist anymore. There are numerous.
Well, I believe that they're leaderless now, as in at one point Tommy Robinson, who was a Rebel News media figure, alternative media figure for a while, I think he was in charge of, insofar as there was any sort of coordination, he was the head of the organisation. But since then, I think owing to a lot of imprisonments and being harassed generally legally. He's stepped down from that. I do believe it is leaderless. So it is basically just an uncoordinated protest group that I guess you could describe in the purest sense of the word is grassroots. It's formed by people that have a common concern. They're coming together on that basis to demonstrate their opposition.
Yeah. Now, in this speech, Prime Minister Starmer claimed that the violence was being caused by outside forces. Right. So this is part of his demonization of these people, and I think they are subject to criticism. These people, as I said, were throwing stones, they were throwing objects at the police, and that should not sit well with us. The police stand between us and chaos, and I think the overwhelming majority of people want to see the police treated with respect. So this is a disturbing consequence. I'm just trying to explain the contextual factors that might have contributed to this violent rebellion against police authority, against the authorities in general. In his speech, so Starmer was correct to be critical of this behaviour, but noteworthy to me was that he blamed it on outside influences, these nasty people who are racists and just want to stir up racial conflict coming from outside Southport, outside that area. Now, that strikes me as a little ironic because the problem being experienced by Southport and many, many other small towns, small cities throughout Britain and indeed London itself, is due to outside interference. What's happening? What is that interference? It's the government bringing in immigrants on a massive, massive scale and flooding, transforming small communities, medium-sized communities. In Ireland, for example, this has now begun in Ireland. The government has decided to basically displace or swamp the local Irish population for the first time, and there's been a general rebellion against that. So attempts, for example, to bring into a little village of 500 people, bring in 100 or 50 refugees and dump them there, thereby transforming that local society. It's being rebelled against. People are gathering and refusing to allow the buses bringing the refugees to enter the towns. This is happening again and again, and there's a real reaction, a real rebellion happening. And so I think we're seeing this, in my experience, for the first time in England. And who knows where it will go. I've just made some notes on that theme as well, if you'd like me to run through that topic about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It'd be good to get a broader look at things because obviously it's not just isolated in England. It's it's worldwide at this point, and basically across the entire European world.
Yeah, exactly. So I just some brief notes here on putting this in a broader context in Australia and in Europe. So I think it's important to begin with good theory, and I'm referring to theory by Professor David Brown in his 2000 book on multiculturalism. Very important points he made. The multicultural governments favour, or he said they license, they approve or permit minorities to express their ethnic interests and their identity over the majority. So the government withdraws its normal approval of the majority running ethnic affairs and says, no, minorities can now run them. We're going to operate in favour of minorities, not in favour of the majority. That's a fundamental switch that happened in the post-World War II era, beginning in the late 50s, maybe certainly by the 60s, at the intellectual level, at the level of mass media, and then by the 70s was entering the universities more and more, and therefore school curricula and so on. In Australia, a reverse ethnic hierarchy has been enforced this way more and more since the early 1970s. Ethnic hierarchy was empowered initially by the cultural left and only much later by mobilized ethnic groups themselves. What I mean is that it's the left cultural elites that began this process, and they empowered minorities who didn't have much power at that stage. They were, by definition, not able democratically to get their own way. They were often generally small minorities, not just minorities, like 40% of them is a majority. These were tiny majorities of 1% of the population or 2% of the population. So they had little power, and the power was given to them, or some power was given to them by the cultural left, beginning with the universities and the mass media, and then spreading to school curricula and so on. The theoretical and practical question is, in Brown's framework, the question is, for how long can leftist anti-white replacement continue before the victims rebel? Right. So we've got a process underway. A process has been established where the establishment has turned, by the 1970s, turned against more and more against the founding majority and began favouring minorities. The key payoff of minorities being open borders immigration, more and more immigration of their co-ethnic, so their numbers grew rapidly. Right now in Australia, for example, we have extraordinary growth rate of various minority ethnic groups that is, it's by growing of many tens of thousands per year. Now, one question is, how long is this a stable process, or will it end itself? Well, is built into it a reaction? And it seems to me that the multicultural establishment is running out of tactics for keeping the founding majority quiet while it is being replaced. In no particular order, let me consider some items. There was a media monopoly that spread the notion of Anglo-Celtic guilt. So the guilt, accusation of guilt, was an early part of the psychological tactics used against European majorities or Western majorities. Then came bipartisanship between the major parties, as explained by Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Bob Hawke explained that the revolution, the ethnic transformation of Australia, could not have happened if the major parties, the coalition on one side and Labor on the other, if they'd not collaborated to keep immigration away from elections. So people were never given the choice, oh, by the way, you're being replaced at a rapid rate. Do you approve of that? Is that okay? Is it okay if we, if Anglo-Celtic Australians become a minority within, 50 or 100 years? That was never asked. It just was done to them. Then came, after bipartisanship, then came indoctrination, informal punishment of white identity, then formal punishment, such as delivered by the Racial Discrimination Act 1975. And then when this was wearing off, Section 18C was added in the 1990s. Section 18C is an Orwellian idea, a piece of legislation which says that if someone says that person has offended me for racial or religious or whatever reasons like that, that statement of offence is prima facie the other person is guilty of it. It runs counter to our common law tradition. it's dangerous, and it has proven dangerous. For example, the prosecution of
Well, we had a actual
Andrew Bolt.
victim of that law on our podcast just a couple of weeks ago. Actually, Nick Folks, he was punished under that for, I think it was basically satirical demonstrations, political demonstrations in opposition to multiculturalism, and 18C was used to crack down on him, and he ended up going to court so many times that it basically forced him out of doing further activism at a certain point.
Well, that's the idea. It's a suppression tactic. And I think it's proven effective. Also, journalist Andrew Bolt was prosecuted under this. You know, the idea that he had offended someone, so he could be prosecuted. Quite extraordinary. And then it seems to me, as the founding population becomes swamped, and we're seeing this already happening in parts of England. Initially, we're trying to explain the reaction to the Southport stabbing and so on. But as the founding population becomes swamped, the multicultural dominance becomes more apparent, with coercive restriction of free speech and jobs, for example, by Section 18C. And it's only a matter of time before rebellion breaks out, one would think. The key issue is who controls the state apparatus, you know, the coercive arms of police and military, the senior public service, the mass media and education. Who controls that? That's what the competition is for. And we, I mean the Australian nation, have been run rings around. You know, we've really lost big time on this issue. We've lost control of these public institutions. And more professors, academics and other analysts who specialize in looking at power relations in societies are admitting that the radical left has successfully, especially the multicultural radical left, has successfully taken over public institutions. That's in the United States, it's in Britain, and certainly in Australia. And the most heart-wrenching example of that is education. So our own children being indoctrinated, being taught to hate their ancestors, to be ashamed of being a white Australian. Now, here's an interesting factor here. In the early days of indiscriminate mass immigration, democracy could empower the founding people because, by definition, they were the majority. So in democracies, majorities should be able to get their own way. For that reason, democratic process was avoided as much as possible, as Prime Minister Bob Hawke admitted. The electorate was never asked whether it wanted mass indiscriminate immigration. In the end stages, and I think we're about to enter the end stages, not quite there, 1 or 2 decades away from the end stages, democracy will favour the new colonisers, the immigrants and their leftist enablers. And by the way, I mention those together, but I only blame their enablers. I don't blame the immigrants themselves. They're people just trying to have a good life and do the best they can and take opportunities and so on. But I think they're overwhelmingly innocent. It's important to make that point, especially in the context of a stabbing, that most immigrants just want to mind their own business, live their lives, have a good life, come to the West with all its wonderful wealth and, you know, work hard and all the rest of it. So they're adding to, of course, the problem is that in the context of a multicultural system, they empower the multicultural hierarchy against the founding ethnic group, in Australia's case, Anglo-Celtic Australians. So, but I believe that they're morally innocent, even if they're participating in this process. Now, the guilty ones are the leftist enablers who've taken over our public institutions. And my final point is that the radical multiculturalists' main game is to prevent white ethnic groups from organising and keep them bottled up and away from media platforms and educational curricula. So that's what they need to do. That's their challenge as these protest movements spring up and as rebellion begins to break out and people begin to get just angry and realize they've been lied to by the establishment for generations, 2 or 3 generations. As this happens, then the name of the game is how to keep them down, how to keep them away from media platforms, how to keep them away from controlling their children's school curricula, just for that bit longer until they're physically swamped. So that is the challenge being faced by the multicultural elites. So that is the overall context. I just wanted to make those notes, put those notes forward. That's part of the context that this stabbing and the reaction to the stabbing in England has taken place in, where the cultural war is now getting real teeth. It's now drawing real blood, the cultural war. And things are going to get worse, I believe.
To draw things closer to home, and I have to fully agree. I think things will get worse before they get better, and that's not something I encourage by any means. I completely oppose violence, political violence in all its forms. However, I do not believe that these people who are protesting in favour of their nation or in opposition to Islam or in opposition to stabbings of children, I don't believe that they really are ideologically motivated. Definitely not a majority of them. I think that most of them are probably from a working class background. I find it very difficult to believe that these people are reading ideological tracts and they're somehow, reading right-wing political theory, and this is what's motivating them. I think that really at a gut level, they're able to recognise what the middle and upper class and the academic class are able to obscure from themselves, which is the plain reality that they are being replaced in their own country and they're being attacked in their own country by an exterior group. That unlike the middle and upper classes, which have, I think, fairly successfully been fooled into believing that, we're one race, the human race, that everyone has similar interests and we can all get along, and that, there is no difference between the various ethnicities. There's no reason you should want to preserve your own group, that all of this is going to be a harmonious change, which are all variations on a similar lie, which is that all human groups are equal. I believe that the lower classes, perhaps the working, I don't want to say lower class, but the working class, or those who are somewhat less educated, who have less to lose if they go and protest down the street. I believe that these people are probably, because they're not consuming this, the mainstream political literature around these issues, they're able to see through what left-wing ideology has obscured. And so for this reason, they appear as right-wing to the mainstream media and to our left-wing academia. But in actuality, I guess they're just people that can see reality and have a very guttural reaction against it, very visceral reaction. They want to change things in a very direct way, which is, let us get in the streets and we'll fight them, or we'll protest with flags and make our voices heard, which I believe is a more reputable, a better way to go about things, which is to use your voice and show up and demonstrate in numbers as opposed to fighting. However, I do think that it's a demonstration that there is still a spirit of resistance to replacement alive in the British people, even if it's not being expressed in the most effective or the most palatable way, or a way that I would necessarily support in full. So I see it as a good thing that that people are reacting against, what was just an absolutely horrible, heinous crime. I mean, stabbing 3 young children. I suppose if you don't think about it, you just sort of glaze over it. It's another victim of multiculturalism, a crime of somebody that you don't know. But I suppose to draw it closer, imagine your daughter or your sister was a victim of this. Just, that's an irreplaceable loss to that family. And it's something that could have been prevented if the British government was legislating in accordance with the interests of the population which it rules over, which is the British people. This African guy from Rwanda, I believe his
Rwanda.
parents were. Yeah, from Rwanda. He would not have been in the country to begin with. This crime would have not been perpetrated if not for multiculturalist ideology and legislation and immigration policy. I suppose it can be a little bit reductionist to draw everything to that level and say, oh, we could have prevented it if this person wasn't in the country, but it's simply true. And so is it's also the case for the many thousands of girls who were victims of the Pakistani rape gangs. And maybe to give an example closer to home, it's true of the Australian girls who were the victims of the Lebanese rape gangs in Sydney, which actually their actions and just generally the actions of the Lebanese community in general in Sydney is what led to our sort of version of these protests, which was the Cronulla riots. And I think that the protesters who showed up to the Cronullas have been sufficiently vilified by the media in the time since. But I mean, think about it. You've lived in a country all your life. Your parents have lived in a country all their life that was fairly safe. You know, Australia has by and large been one of the safest, most harmonious, most peaceful, stable countries in all of history. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say. And within the lifetimes of the young men that showed up to protest, these places have grown more dangerous for their sisters, for their girlfriends, for their wives, for their mothers. And they wanted to get out and show that, no, this is still Australia and express their own identity. Of course, things got out of hand there as well. Violence occurred. But once again, I think that the fact that the media vilified these men who protested and perhaps went too far in that direction, instead of attacking and trying to oppose or even just tell the true story on the Arabic, Muslim, Lebanese criminals and just generally, poor behaviours, poor cultural behaviours, I think that is quite telling of whose side of the debate these people, or not even debate, whose side of the country these people are on. Are they in favour of the country or in favour of a vague ideology which has its ends in the destruction of our country? So I think that's, hopefully that draws things a little bit closer to home, because it's easier to think, oh, that's happening in Europe, that's not happening here. However, I'd say that the first occurrence was the Cronulla riots, but I don't think it'll be the last. As white Australians shrink as a proportion of this country, it's hard to imagine that there won't be similar events instigated by either side, whether that be, for example, we've seen lots of Indian violence or increasing Indian violence in Melbourne versus other ethnic groups or religious groups. Perhaps it'll be instigated by them or by Muslims or any other foreign group in Australia. Or it might even be instigated by white Australians, hard to tell. But I do not believe that it will be the last of its kind. Ethnic violence is only going to grow in this country. And I say that as an unfortunate fact. I wish it wasn't so. I wish the government's immigration policy wasn't leading us down this path. But I said my statement. Would you guys like to add anything?
Yeah, I think one common thread that is both in the Southport riots and in the Cronulla riots was a refusal by the political establishment to do anything about it. And so people had this view that they had to take it into their own hands. I want to pin this back to Frank. Do you see any sort of way forward that isn't violent? Is there a way that this can be resolved peacefully, or is violence baked into the cake of the multicultural society?
A very good question. I begin by, again, putting violence into context. It's part of a spectrum of conflictual behaviour. So, and this has been studied, by the way, scientifically. For example, ethnic parties are an act of aggression. That's an act of conflict. Polarisation in politics, polarisation in society is conflicting, right? It creates a tension, creates anxiety, and can hurt people psychologically. So violence is in that spectrum. So then you get more and more aggression involved, and then there can be a trigger, and you can have violence. I think I'm saying this because we shouldn't focus too much on violence. It's of course, we want to minimise, we want to live in a peaceful society, but peaceful means more than the avoidance of violence. It also means equity. We want a relatively flat, from experience, we should know that we want a relatively flat class structure with not great difference between the richest and the poorest. We want to live in a society with high levels of trust. And that is being lost wholesale across the West, by the way. This is a precious thing. Trust is lost. What's hurting it really is diversity. And there are degrees of diversity, right? So not all ethnic groups cause the same amount of diversity. Ethnic groups and cultures and races are more kindred to some than to others. So one can have, for example, selective immigration policies that are Big Tent. They can still be Big Tent policies, where numerous different groups and there's a degree of diversity can be allowed, but they're chosen to be similar, so the abrasiveness is minimised. And what's happening now in the West, especially in the Anglosphere, where we have the most replacement level immigration, is that the people are fighting back. I think, despite all the violence, and except for the violence, I think it's a good thing. So I approve of the comments made earlier. I think people are fighting back, and I think that it's the working class that is at the forefront. Why? Because they're less educated, which means less indoctrinated. They're more natural, they're more instinctive. They want their communities back. And looked at the other way around, from the side of, from the point of view of the multicultural agenda, they have suffered most because it's their communities in which refugees are dumped and immigrants are dumped, initially in the first generation until they manage to work themselves into the middle class. It's the same in Australia. Our mass immigration began in working class areas in Western Sydney and western suburbs of Melbourne. And the working class, they have their interests, they have their rights, and they're fighting for them. And another comment that was made that I agree with is that it's not intellectually guided. I don't believe it's strategically guided. That's why I think Prime Minister Keir Starmer got it wrong. This is not just outside influences. This is a spontaneous uprising by the people. And evidence of that is its chaos. And its frequent irrationality. For example, the rumour spread, the murderer is a Muslim. Well, apparently he wasn't a Muslim, so they got that wrong. And also the attacks on police. This is anger, it's frustration. The police, especially at the lower levels, the police are simply not to blame. They do what they're told. They have a civilian leadership, political leadership, and they're told what to do. So I think what is desperately needed is that the Anglo-Celtic founding populations of Britain and of the Anglosphere, of Britain, Australia, New Zealand, get organised. They need to get organised. They need leadership. They need their own think tanks advising them of what the situation is. And a lot of this chaos, a lot of this irrationality would evaporate, and you'd have more electoral politics, deliberate, peaceful tactics being used. And one thing to fear is more of what we've seen, is this spontaneous eruption of anger. And it has every sign, to my eye, it has every sign of pent-up frustration and anger being released in an emotional burst. And we know from experience that this can be ugly. It's already been ugly. So without organising, and we need our lobby groups, our organisers, not just political parties. I think lobby organisations, cultural organisations such as the British Australian Community, the BAC. That's the role we're trying to take, trying to provide Anglo-Celtic peoples with the sort of multicultural services that all other groups have had at their fingertips. In fact, they've been provided by the government with legislation helping and so on. There's been affirmative action in recruitment in corporations and the public service. There's, in effect, affirmative action in education. Young people are educated into the sensitivities and needs and rights of minorities, not their own group, and so on. So we need a rebalancing of this ethnic hierarchy. And my instinct, and I think the instinct of most Australians, would be, we don't want ethnic hierarchy. No, we don't want it. We just want to live and let live, and we want a quality of rights. But it's looking more and more to me that the choice we're being offered is either we're being subordinated in preparation for being replaced, swamped in our own country, or we have to take the lead back again. We have to take the lead back again and begin saying to politicians, if you want to remain in government, if you want to remain in the parliament, don't attack Anglo-Celtic peoples. There'll be a political price to pay. We need to be pressuring the corporations. You know, if you behave this way, if you enable, for example, the big corporations that run social media and so on, we should be able to say to them, if you want our custom, if you want us as customers, then don't do us harm. Don't treat us with contempt. And that can only happen with well-run professional or lobby organisations.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And if anyone wants to support the British Australian community, they can head to the BAC website. I don't know it off the top of my head. Do you, Dr. Salter?
Sorry, what is it?
What was the URL for the BAC? So people can check it out if they're interested.
It's quite long. It's BritishAustralianCommunity.com.au.
Yeah, okay. So I encourage everyone to go check that out. The BAC is a fantastic organisation, one of the most professional in this scene, and really it's in a category of its own. We're approaching the end of our time. I just wanted to read one comment because people so often start in the middle of the story as though it is these patriotic protesters or ourselves which are instigating this ethnic strife, as they describe it. But I'd like to read a comment here from Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser. Okay, so I have it here, and this is from the Parliament website, Australian Parliament. You can visit it at parlinfo.aph.gov.au. And this is a comment from Senator Branders, and he's talking about Malcolm Fraser's and, more broadly, the Liberal Party's support for multiculturalism in Australia. And it's very telling, I believe, perhaps even more explicit than what Prime Minister Bob Hawke said in regards to coordinating between the two parties to keep immigration and generally the ability to decide against immigration and multiculturalism off the electorate. So it says here, it says, I want to read to the Senate a lost piece of Australian history, which is recounted by Dr. Mark Lopez in his book, The Origins of Multiculturalism in Australian Politics, 1945 to 75. Dr. Lopez speaks of a function hosted by the Greek Australian Liberal Association, GALA, on the 26th of October 1975. On that occasion, the Leader of the Opposition, soon to be Prime Minister Mr. Malcolm Fraser, delivered a speech. Dr. Lopez recounts the story. Fraser used the GALA ball to declare his support for multiculturalism and ending the era of Anglo-conformism. Fraser's speech, drafted by George Yu, included the following unambiguous statement. we as Liberals are committed to encouraging and supporting diversity in our multicultural society. We reject the sterile Anglo-conformity of past days. Georgiou, after presenting the draft to Fraser, had questioned him about whether he was aware of the implications of those lines. I said, "Do you really want to say this?" And he said yes. Georgiou had wanted Fraser to support multiculturalism, but only then realised the extent of Fraser's commitment. Fraser later explained his motives in these terms, because whatever the Labour Party was going to do, whatever Gough was going to do, it needed somebody on the conservative side of politics to really say that Anglo-Saxon Australia is dead. That this isn't the kind of society we are. And I'll just leave on that note, but I think that sort of encapsulates everything, that people act as though we are going to war against the establishment, against mainstream Australian politics and multiculturalism. But in reality, it has been the major parties and the mainstream which has been at war with white Australia for decades. So we'll finish on that note. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Frank Salter. Would you like to give a final comment where people can find more of your work? I hear you're working on a book upcoming. Maybe you'd like to tease a little bit about that.
Yes, it's my third collected essays, and this time it's on the national question. So it's by far much larger. It will be much larger. I finished the book. It's now in production. It should be available in a couple of months. It's going to be called The National Question and Human Nature, Collected Essays 3. And it has 89 chapters. I've never produced a monster like that before. But it's most of my writings on ethnicity, multiculturalism, immigration, and so on. And people can follow my work chronologically through and see how I began looking at it, and beginning scientifically, and then became more and more interested in policy. How can societies be made more cohesive, more peaceful? How can civil war be avoided? How can ethnic replacement be avoided, and so on? So I think that should be interesting. And also, I have a book out fairly recently. It's the voice referendum. So here it is. I'm showing that here. It's the voice referendum. And that was, I produced that just before the voice referendum. I'll say the book is not just about the referendum. There are a lot of fundamental points being made that reflects the British Australian community's view on what our long-term relationship should be with the Aboriginal people. I refer in it to the special relationship that has developed between Aborigines and Anglo-Celtic Australia, and about where obviously Anglo-Celtic interests lie, but also where the Aboriginal interests lie. And it's not in conflict; it's in cooperation, and it's to stabilise and improve the situation. I believe we need to steadily push out the radical left, the revolutionaries, push them out. To reduce the influence of Anglophobia, which brings me to the final book I've mentioned. The book, our most important book right now in the BAC, is Anglophobia, The Unrecognised Hatred. And that's historical, and it's sociological, and it's socio-biological. I think it's interesting. I recommend that your listeners have a look at that book. It's available on Amazon. It's available as an audio book as well.
I have it in both audio and paper format, so I encourage everyone to do the same and double support the book and the BAC.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that, Nick.
Yeah, no, I highly recommend the Anglophobia book. That's the only one I've read out of the three that you just mentioned there, but I'll definitely have to check out the Voice referendum book, and I'll share around your new one when it releases. So is the Voice referendum available for sale at the moment?
Yes, it is. It's on Amazon.
Okay. I'll have to check it out. I'll put the link in the description. Everyone should go buy that. No, but thank you for joining us this week.
You can also buy it at your local bookshop. which can acquire it for you.
Oh, is that right? There you go. Well,
Might be an
thank you
awkward
for joining us.
conversation, in all fairness.
Yeah, it might be. Hey,
No
I mean,
librarians
considering the
these days.
staffs, the staff of the average bookshop, I mean, can't imagine that they're going to be big fans of the voice referendum by Dr. Frank Salter of the British Australian
Oh,
community.
you'll have to go in and demand the book. You'll have to say, I want you to sell me this book.
I think you're going to start your own riots here.
You might have to claim that you're a Jewish man and this is office works to get your way, I think.
Yeah, that was a funny story, wasn't it? Anyway, thank you for joining us this week, Dr. Salter. Matthew, just take us away quickly with where everyone can find the rest of the National Observer's works, and then we'll sign off.
Certainly, you go to thenationalobserver.co, find all our articles, all our podcasts there. Got a brand new article from Elias Priestley up there. You should check it out. And go support us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and share it around. Thanks, bye.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody.